In the history of the United States, one of the most dangerous things a black man or woman could do was succeed. Economic mobility for African Americans was not celebrated. It was feared. It was seen as a direct challenge to a social order built to keep them at the bottom. Every acre of land purchased, every business opened, every step toward financial independence was treated as an act of defiance. And in the Jim Crow South, defiance often came with deadly consequences. Imagine living in a time when the simple act of working your own land, sending your children to school, or seeking fair wages could put a target on your back. Success was not only discouraged, it was violently punished. The power structure of the early 20th century thrived on black poverty. It depended on keeping men and women locked into cycles of debt, dependency, and silence. To break free from that cycle meant risking everything. This is the backdrop of the story. You are about to hear the story of William Carreker in 1909. Carreker was more than just a farmer. He was a man who refused to bow to the system of exploitation around him. He owned land, he worked it with pride, and he lived as independently as the era would allow. But that independence came at a cost. When he opened his home to an elderly blind preacher who dared to speak out against injustice, the forces of white supremacy saw not just two men, but a dangerous spark that could ignite change. The events that followed remind us how fragile freedom was for black Americans in the early 1900s. A single gunshot, a single act of resistance, set off a chain of retaliation that would end in murder. Mob violence and terror meant to send a message to an entire community. But telling this story today is not about despair, it is about remembrance. It is about reclaiming voices that were silenced and understanding how far-reaching the struggle for justice has always been. As we journey into this history, I want you to think about what economic independence truly meant in a world built to deny it. What risks would you take for dignity, for freedom, for the right to stand on your own land? These are not just questions of the past, they echo into the present. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told and remembered, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support helps us uncover forgotten histories and bring them into the light, where they belong. So settle in as we step back to 1909, to Talbot County, Georgia, where William Carreker's fight for independence would collide with the forces determined to crush it. This is more than a story of land and labor, it is a story of resistance, sacrifice, and the price of daring to rise. Freedom, when it finally arrived for millions of African Americans after the Civil War, was supposed to be the beginning of a new life. It promised independence, dignity, and the chance to build something lasting out of centuries of struggle. But that promise was quickly reshaped into something far harsher. Freedom did not mean safety. It did not mean equality. Instead, it brought new forms of oppression, no longer through the chains of slavery, but through racial violence, restrictive laws, and economic control designed to keep black communities from ever rising too far. This new reality was a different kind of bondage, more subtle in some ways, more brutal in others, and its effects rippled through every corner of life. The violence that followed emancipation was not random. It was deliberate, organized, and often carried out with the full support of local authorities. Night riders, mobs, and lynchings became tools of intimidation meant to remind black citizens that their lives could be taken at any moment. To walk alone at night, to speak out, or even to display modest success could provoke attacks. Families lived with the constant awareness that they were never truly safe, not even in their own homes. Violence was the shadow that followed freedom, a constant reminder that the price of progress could be death. At the same time, lawmakers across the South worked tirelessly to codify inequality. The period known as Reconstruction had briefly opened doors allowing black men to vote, hold office, and carve out space in public life. But as federal troops withdrew and local control returned to the hands of those determined to maintain white supremacy, a new system of laws emerged. These were the infamous Black Codes, which limited mobility, restricted employment, and criminalized everyday behaviors. Later, Jim Crow laws would follow, segregating schools, businesses, and public spaces, ensuring that even freedom itself would feel like a cage. In practice, these laws sent a clear message. Emancipation may have ended slavery, but the system of control would continue under another name. Economic power, too, became a weapon. Land was scarce, and opportunities to purchase it were deliberately blocked. Banks refused loans, contracts were manipulated, and many families were forced into sharecropping arrangements that trapped them in endless cycles of debt. A man could work from sunrise to sunset, harvest a field he had nurtured with his own hands, and still find that the numbers never added up in his favor. The system was designed to keep him dependent, to keep him tethered to land he would never own. For those who did manage to secure property, the risks only grew. Ownership meant independence, and independence was perceived as defiance. Too often, successful black farmers or business owners found themselves targeted by jealousy, sabotage, or outright violence intended to strip them of everything they had built. Yet, despite these barriers, black communities continued to strive. Churches became centers of strength, schools blossomed in defiance of laws meant to stifle education, and families passed down not only land when they could but also traditions of resilience and pride. Still, every step forward came with new obstacles, new dangers, and new strategies of control from those determined to maintain dominance. What freedom had given in name, the system sought to take away in practice. This was the world into which William Carreker lived. To understand his story, you have to imagine not just the weight of one man's struggle, but the weight of an entire system pressing down on him. The act of farming his own land, of standing on soil that he could claim as his own, was far more than an economic choice. It was an act of quiet rebellion. And when he opened his door to a preacher who dared to speak against injustice, that rebellion became louder. It was no longer only about planting crops or raising a family. It was about protecting the dignity of a people who refused to be silenced. But the system that feared black independence was always watching, always ready to react. One moment of resistance, one shot fired in self-defense, could spiral into tragedy. The laws, the violence, the economic traps, all of them worked together to ensure that freedom never stretched too far beyond its narrow boundaries. Carreker's story is not just about his own choices. It is about the ways in which those choices collided with a society that viewed black ambition as a threat. The irony of this history is that the promise of freedom became a battlefield. On one side stood men and women determined to carve out lives of dignity, no matter the risks. On the other stood laws, mobs, and economic structures designed to strip away that dignity at every turn. Every dollar earned, every acre farmed, every sermon preached carried weight, because it was not only about survival but about proving that freedom could be real, if only for a moment. As we look back, it is clear that the violence, the laws, and the economic control were not accidents of history, they were strategies. They were carefully designed to maintain the old order under a new name, to remind freedmen and women that while slavery had ended, oppression had not. And yet, the very fact that we are able to tell these stories today is proof that those strategies did not succeed completely. Families endured. Communities persevered. And voices, though silenced in their own time, still echo across the generations. The story of William Carreker and others like him forces us to ask difficult questions. What does freedom mean when it comes bound in chains of fear and debt? What does progress look like when every step forward brings the threat of violence? And how do we measure resilience in the face of a system built to crush it? These are not questions confined to the past. They remain relevant as long as the legacies of inequality still shape our present. To listen to this history is to honor those who lived it, to recognize the depth of their courage, and to understand the heavy cost of freedom when it is met with resistance. This is more than a story of oppression, it is a story of survival, of endurance, and of the unbreakable will of a people who refuse to be erased. And it is within their struggle that we find lessons still urgently needed today. After the Civil War, when emancipation promised freedom to millions who had been enslaved, the South stood at a crossroads. Plantations once filled with forced labor now faced collapse, and the wealth of white landowners was threatened by the simple fact that black men and women could finally make choices for themselves. But instead of accepting this new reality, those in power turned to the law as their weapon. Southern states crafted a system of restrictive measures that disguised themselves as legitimate contracts, but in truth served as chains. These laws bound African Americans to the very landowners who had once claimed them as property, ensuring that freedom remained little more than a fragile illusion. The so-called labor contracts that emerged in this period were not agreements between equals. They were traps. Black families were pressured, and often forced, to sign contracts that committed them to work for white landowners under strict conditions. Failure to comply could result in punishment, fines, or imprisonment. And once imprisoned, many found themselves leased out again as laborers, their bodies once more fueling the wealth of others. The cycle was endless, designed not to provide opportunity but to strip away independence. A man who dreamed of farming his own land or finding better wages elsewhere could be branded a criminal simply for walking away. For those who resisted, the consequences were severe. Vagrancy laws, for example, targeted anyone without proof of employment, making unemployment itself a crime. Imagine being told that you were free, only to discover that the absence of a signed contract could send you to jail. The prisons quickly filled with men whose only offense was the desire to live freely. And those prisons became another marketplace of labor, where work was extracted through force rather than choice. Freedom was turned inside out, transformed into a legal framework that kept the same hierarchy in place while pretending to honor emancipation. On paper, these contracts and laws looked official, even reasonable to outside eyes. They were cloaked in the language of order and productivity, but their true purpose was clear to those forced to live under them. They ensured that the wealth of the South remained concentrated in the hands of landowners, while black labor continued to serve as the foundation of that wealth. Sharecropping, debt peonage, and labor leasing all fit neatly into this structure. And for every family that dreamed of independence, there were countless barriers waiting to keep them tied to the same fields, the same debts, the same dependence. Still, the human spirit sought ways to resist. Families held on to their traditions. Churches became sanctuaries, and small plots of land, when they could be secured, became symbols of dignity. But the system was relentless, and every attempt at progress was met with new obstacles. A man might save for years to buy a patch of soil, only to lose it through manipulated contracts or fraudulent debts. A woman might take in work outside the fields, only to face fines for stepping outside the role assigned to her by a system determined to keep her in place. This was the backdrop against which men like William Carreker lived. His story of independence, of farming his own land and choosing his own path, stands in stark contrast to the laws that sought to strip such choices away. By refusing to submit fully to the structures of forced labor, he embodied a form of defiance. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was powerful. To live freely, to open his home to a preacher who spoke truth, was to challenge an order that used laws and violence to silence both ambition and faith. And that is why these laws mattered so deeply. They were not just about labor. They were about control. They dictated where a person could work, how they could live, and even what dreams they were allowed to have. They turned freedom into something conditional, granted only if one accepted the terms set by those still clinging to power. The cruel brilliance of the system was that it used the very tools of governance, courts, contracts, and codes to accomplish what chains had once done. Looking back, it becomes clear that the period after emancipation was not simply a time of freedom gained but of freedom contested. Every law written, every contract enforced, was part of a broader effort to redefine what liberty meant for African Americans. And in most cases, liberty was written into dependency. To understand the depth of this reality is to recognize why success, like that of Carreker, was seen as such a threat. Independence was not only rare, it was dangerous, because it undermined the entire structure of control that white landowners had so carefully rebuilt after the war. The story of these restrictive laws is a reminder that oppression does not always wear the same face. Sometimes it arrives in the form of violence, visible and brutal. Other times, it comes in the form of ink on paper, hidden in the lines of a contract, or buried in the language of the law. Both forms are equally destructive, and both worked hand in hand to ensure that freedom remained narrow, fragile, and always under threat. And yet, even within this system, there were sparks of resilience. The very existence of stories like Carreker's shows that while the laws could bind, they could not erase the will to live freely. His choices, and those of countless others, represent a defiance that outlasted the codes written to contain it. They remind us that freedom, once imagined, cannot be fully taken away. No matter how many contracts are signed or punishments enforced, it may bend under the weight of injustice, but it does not break. To tell this story is to honor that resilience. It is to understand that the battle for independence did not end with the stroke of emancipation, but continued in fields, in homes, in churches, and in every contract signed under duress. It is to see clearly how freedom was reshaped, redefined, and restricted, yet never completely extinguished. And it is to recognize that the fight for true liberty has always been about more than laws on paper. It has been about the determination of a people to claim dignity, even in the face of systems built to deny it. When slavery ended, it was supposed to mark a new beginning, but what followed instead was a system that bound black families to the same fields, the same struggles, and the same dependency that they had endured for generations. Only this time it came dressed in the disguise of contracts, debts, and laws that carried the weight of legitimacy. Sharecropping emerged as the bridge between slavery and freedom, but in reality it was a bridge built to circle back to the same place. A system that gave just enough hope to keep people working while ensuring that they would never truly escape. A black farmer might till the land from dawn until nightfall, nurturing crops with his sweat, his family by his side, believing that at the end of the season his labor would bring him closer to independence. Yet when the numbers were calculated by the landowner, when the debts for seed, tools, and food were added up, the harvest almost always vanished into thin air, leaving only another season of obligation behind. The cruel genius of sharecropping was that it carried the illusion of choice. Families could say they worked their own plots. They could imagine themselves as tenants rather than property. But the system was carefully designed to keep them trapped. Landowners controlled not only the fields but the stores, the prices, and the credit. A man might walk into a store thinking he was buying seed on credit, but by the time the harvest came, he would discover that the debt had multiplied, that the interest charged had swallowed the little he thought he had earned. It was a game in which the rules were written by those who had no intention of letting him win. And so year after year, the cycle repeated itself: debt at planting, hope at harvest, disappointment at settlement, and dependency that stretched from one generation to the next. These economic chains were reinforced by law, Southern legislatures passed measures made it nearly impossible to break free from contracts, punishing anyone who tried to leave with fines, arrest, or imprisonment. Vagrancy statutes turned freedom of movement into a crime, so that a man who dared to walk away from a dishonest contract could be branded as idle and sent to jail, where his labor would again be leased out. In this way, prisons became an extension of the plantation, a place where the old order lived on under the language of justice. What looked like legal order on paper was in practice a continuation of control, with laws functioning as the overseers of a system that refused to release its grip. For black families, the weight of this system was felt in every aspect of life. A father might dream of saving enough to purchase a small piece of land, but each season the balance tilted further out of reach, the debts rising faster than the wages. A mother might dream of sending her children to school, but the demand for labor kept young hands in the fields, bending over cotton instead of books. Families that should have been climbing toward independence were instead dragged deeper into dependence, their futures mortgaged against debts that were never meant to be paid off. Freedom was redefined as the right to labor endlessly without ever moving forward, a cruel parody of the liberty that had been promised. And yet, within this grim structure, resistance endured. Churches became places where hope was preached and shared. Schools emerged in secret and in defiance, and families clung to one another as anchors against despair. The system of sharecropping and discriminatory law was built to break the spirit, but the spirit was not so easily crushed. People learned to stretch what little they had, to save in hidden ways, to lean on their communities when the world outside offered only hostility. Every act of endurance was a form of defiance, a refusal to let the system claim victory over their dignity. This was the world into which William Carreker's story unfolded. His independence as a landowner, his choice to stand apart from the system of contracts that bound so many, marked him as different, and in that difference lay danger. For a black man to own land, to work it freely, to open his doors to voices of truth like that of the blind preacher, was to defy the entire structure of sharecropping and legal bondage. His life represented what the system feared most, proof that it was possible to live outside the cycle of debt and dependency, proof that freedom could be real if given the chance. And it was precisely because his life embodied this possibility that it became a target, a threat to be eliminated in order to preserve the fragile illusion of control. The story of sharecropping and discriminatory law is not simply about economics or policy. It is about the deliberate creation of a world where freedom was conditional, where independence was dangerous, and where dignity had to be fought for in every season. It reminds us that the end of slavery was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a new battle, fought not with chains but with ledgers, not with whips but with laws, and not with auctions but with contracts. It was a system that sought to convince the world that freedom had arrived while ensuring that its substance remained out of reach. To remember this history is to see the depth of resilience it demanded. It is to honor the men and women who, despite the weight of debt and the threat of law, continued to plant seeds not only in the ground but in their families and communities, seeds of hope that carried forward into future generations. It is to understand why stories like Carreker's matter, because they show us both the cruelty of the system and the courage it took to defy it. Freedom in name alone is not enough, and the history of sharecropping teaches us that without true independence, without the power to control one's labor and one's future, freedom becomes another word for survival. Yet survival itself, in such conditions, was an act of bravery. The cycle of debt and dependency may have defined the era, but the determination to endure and to resist ensured that the story did not end there. The voices silenced by contracts and violence still echo, and they call on us to remember that true freedom is not given. It is claimed, often at great cost, by those unwilling to accept anything less. As courts and lawmakers slowly began to chip away at the harshest forms of peonage and debt laws, The old systems of written contracts and legal codes no longer held the same iron grip over black laborers. On paper, freedom seemed to be advancing, and a few voices in the nation dared to believe that perhaps the promises of emancipation were inching closer to reality. But for landowners and those who had long depended on controlling others for their wealth, the erosion of these legal tools was not a signal to yield. It was a call to adapt. Where laws once bound, violence now stepped in. What had once been written in ink was now enforced with fists, ropes, and guns. Control shifted from courthouse ledgers to nighttime gatherings of armed men who took it upon themselves to preserve the social order by force. The shift was not sudden but gradual, and it was born from fear. Each small gain by black families, whether it was the ability to negotiate better wages, to attend schools that fostered literacy, or to buy even a modest patch of land, was perceived as a threat to the carefully constructed hierarchy. White landowners who had grown comfortable wielding the power of law found themselves unsettled when courts began to strike down vagrancy laws and debt peonage statutes. If black men and women could not so easily be jailed for breaking contracts, if the whip was no longer sanctioned by the courtroom, then a new mechanism of discipline had to take its place. The result was a return to raw, unrestrained violence carried out not in the name of justice, but in the name of dominance. Communities across the South learned quickly what this meant. A dispute over wages could turn into a deadly encounter, with a black worker punished not through fines, but through brutal retribution. A simple act of defiance, such as refusing to be cheated at a local store, could be answered by mobs who believed fear was a more reliable weapon than law. The effect was devastating. Where once the courtroom had been used to keep people in line, now it was the ever-present threat of sudden, unpredictable violence that enforced obedience. Fear became the unspoken contract, signed not with pen but with blood. The cruelty of this system lay in its unpredictability. A family could spend years carefully navigating the rules, avoiding open defiance, and still find themselves targeted. A rumor could be enough to invite punishment. A preacher's sermon, a worker's question, a child's bold words, any of these could be seized upon as evidence that the fragile boundaries of white control were being challenged. And when such moments arose, mobs assembled quickly, often with the tacit or open approval of local authorities who turned away, offered keys, or even joined in. The message was always the same. The law may have weakened, but power remained, and it would be enforced by violence if necessary. This reliance on force was not just about punishing individuals. It was about sending messages to entire communities. When a man was dragged from his home or a preacher silenced, it was not only to remove one voice but to remind all others of the risks of resistance. Bridges, trees, and courthouse squares became stages where violence was carried out publicly, ensuring that the memory of terror lingered long after the act itself. In this way, violence became both a tool of control and a language of intimidation, shaping the choices of thousands who knew that survival often meant silence. Yet even within this landscape of fear, courage continued to surface. The very fact that violence was needed to maintain order revealed a truth the landowners feared to admit. The old legal tools were no longer enough, and the spirit of resistance could not be extinguished by laws alone. Each act of violence testified not only to the cruelty of the system, but also to the resilience of those who dared to imagine another way of living. For every mob that assembled, there were men and women who refused to forget that freedom was promised, who taught their children to hope, who whispered stories of dignity even when speaking them aloud was too dangerous. It was into this charged atmosphere that William Carreker's story unfolded. His independence as a landowner and his willingness to offer shelter to a preacher who spoke uncomfortable truths positioned him at the center of this clash between fading legal control and rising violence. To those invested in preserving the old order, he was more than just one man. He was a symbol of what they feared most, a future in which black independence might spread, eroding their authority. And so, when confrontation came to his doorstep, It carried not only the weight of a personal dispute, but the full force of a system determined to maintain itself at any cost. The turn from law to violence is one of the most sobering lessons of this era, because it shows how deeply the struggle for freedom was resisted. It reminds us that injustice does not vanish when statutes are struck down. For those who lose their grip through law may grasp for it more fiercely through force. It demonstrates how progress, however small, often provokes backlash, and how the cost of resistance is measured not only in laws rewritten but in lives risked. Looking back, it becomes clear that the reliance on violence was both an admission of weakness and a desperate bid for control. Those who clung to the old order understood that their system was cracking, that the structures of law no longer held the same weight, and so they wielded fear as their final defense. But in doing so, they revealed the fragility of their dominance. For a power that relies on terror is always a power standing on unsteady ground. The courage of those who endured, resisted, and continued to live with dignity despite the constant threat is what gives this history its enduring meaning. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit does not yield easily, and that the price of freedom, though great, is always worth remembering. By the dawn of the 20th century, the South was still a place bound tightly by the legacies of bondage. And though the chains of law and contract had begun to weaken, the grip of racial hierarchy was as firm as ever. Land remained the great marker of independence, the one possession that could elevate a man above dependence. Yet it was also the most closely guarded symbol of white authority. To own land as a black man in Georgia was not simply to farm soil. It was to challenge a system that thrived on keeping black families tethered to someone else's fields. It was to embody the possibility that the carefully constructed order could be undone. By 1909, William Carreker had become such a man. Born in Georgia not long before the Civil War came to its bloody conclusion, Carreker grew up in a world reshaped by emancipation yet still weighted with oppression. He was not content to live as a sharecropper or tenant, forever indebted to others. Through persistence and hard work, he managed to acquire his own land, something rare and deeply unsettling to his white neighbors. In a county where cotton ruled the rhythm of life, and where thousands of black workers remained tied to the fields of white planters, Carreker stood apart. His independence was visible in every row of crops he tended on his own property, in every decision he made without asking permission, in every day he lived beyond the grasp of a contract written to keep him down. This independence did not go unnoticed. In the eyes of the landowning class, Carreker represented not just one man but a dangerous example. If one black farmer could own and work his own land, what was to stop others from dreaming the same? What was to stop them from walking away from the cycle of debt, from resisting the contracts, from rejecting the authority of those who had controlled their families for generations? The very existence of men like Carreker whispered to others that freedom could be more than survival, that dignity could be rooted in soil owned outright rather than borrowed through endless labor. And so, Carreker's life became a challenge to the racial order, not through speeches or rebellion, but simply by living with autonomy. The threat grew sharper when he chose to open his home to an elderly blind preacher, a man who spoke to his community with words that cut to the core of their condition. This preacher reminded black families that though slavery had been abolished in law, the system that bound them remained alive in practice, and he urged them to seek a true liberation by rejecting the control of white planters. His words planted seeds of unrest, not because they were false but because they rang true to those who lived each day under the weight of debt and dependency. To white landowners, the presence of this preacher was intolerable, and to shelter him was to invite danger. Yet Carreker did not turn him away. In doing, Carreker became more than a symbol of independence. He became a guardian of resistance, a man willing to stand alongside voices that demanded change even when silence would have been safer. For the white community of Talbot County, this was the last straw. Their fears of losing control over their black laborers found a focal point in Carreker's farm, and whispers of unrest spread through the county. The same families who had once relied on laws to secure their dominance now looked to violence as the solution. And Carreker, with his land and his defiance, became their target. It is important to understand what it meant for him to hold his ground at that moment. He was not a politician speaking from a podium, nor a leader commanding an army. He was a farmer, a man of the soil, who chose to live independently and to extend hospitality to another man who sought freedom in truth. Yet it was precisely this ordinary defiance that made him extraordinary. For the system depended not only on grand acts of rebellion but on the quiet compliance of everyday life. To live differently, to refuse to bend to the order, was enough to unsettle the foundation of white supremacy. By 1909, William Carreker's life was a contradiction the South could not tolerate. He was proof that black independence was possible, that the cycle of dependency was not unbreakable, that dignity could be claimed in the very soil that had once been watered with the sweat and blood of enslaved labor. His farm was more than land. It was a statement, and for that reason, he was watched, resented, and ultimately marked as an enemy. The story that would soon unfold was not only about Carreker as an individual, but about the lengths to which the system would go to preserve itself. His fate was sealed not by the content of his character, but by what his life represented to those who felt their power slipping away. In him, they saw a glimpse of a future where their authority would no longer be absolute, where freedom might spread beyond paper and become lived reality. And so, in the summer of 1909, his name would be etched into history not for the land he tilled but for the defiance he symbolized. A defiance that cost him his life but ensured that his story would not be forgotten. William Carreker's place in history is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful acts of resistance are not the loudest but the simplest. To claim ownership of one's labor, to protect another in need, to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice, these choices may seem small, but in a world built on oppression, they are revolutionary. His story carries forward the truth that freedom has always been more than a declaration. It has been a struggle lived daily by those who dared to exist outside the boundaries set for them. And in 1909, in a quiet county in Georgia, Carreker lived that struggle until the system that feared him most could no longer ignore him. The summer heat of Georgia in 1909 carried with it more than the weight of the sun. It carried whispers of unrest, carried on the voices of men who refused to surrender entirely to silence. Among those voices was that of an elderly blind preacher, a man who had lived long enough to see bondage fall in law but also long enough to see how its shadow lingered across the South. He had no riches and no land of his own, but he carried something more dangerous than property, a message that reminded black families that they had a right to more than mere survival, that dignity could not be dictated by the landowners who claimed control over their labor, and that their lives were not destined to remain at the mercy of debts and contracts designed to keep them in chains without shackles. His blindness only seemed to heighten the gravity of his words. As if stripped of sight, he saw even more clearly the truth of the world around him. When William Carreker opened his doors to this preacher, he was doing more than offering shelter. He was giving safe harbor to ideas that frightened the very foundation of the county's order. In Talbot County, land defined power, and Carreker had already unsettled white farmers by daring to cultivate his own fields outside of their grasp. But when he welcomed the preacher into his home, he allowed those fields to become a gathering ground for words that challenged the system more directly than any plow or harvest could. Families came quietly, listening to sermons that were not of heaven alone, but of the earth beneath their feet, of the right to work it freely, of the duty to reject fear as the currency of survival. The preacher's voice carried across the cabins and fields, reminding his listeners that their toil had value beyond what the white planters assigned it, that their worth was not measured in cotton bales or rents paid, but in the unyielding humanity they had carried through centuries of suffering. to the men and women who had been told daily that their only choice was obedience. These words struck like fresh air in a stifling room. They were not calls for violence, but they were calls for courage, for the refusal to be bent forever by injustice. They were reminders that the struggle for true freedom did not end in 1865, but continued every day in the choices they made to stand or to kneel. For white farmers, however, these gatherings were deeply unsettling. They heard not only the sermons but the potential they carried. To them, the preacher represented a spark that could ignite discontent among the workers who still picked their cotton and filled their ledgers. If those workers began to see their lives differently, if they began to walk away from exploitative contracts, if they chose to stand alongside men like Carreker who had carved a path of independence, then the entire system that kept wealth and power in their hands could begin to unravel. Fear gripped them more tightly than reason, for they had long depended not just on labor but on submission. And the preacher's words threatened to loosen that hold. The preacher's blindness gave his presence an almost prophetic quality. Though his eyes could no longer see, his voice painted visions of a different kind of future, one where black families tilled their own soil and passed it to their children, where labor was freely given rather than demanded, where dignity did not depend on permission. For those who listened in Carreker's yard or at his kitchen table, the message was not abstract. It was embodied by their host. William Carreker stood before them as living proof that independence was possible, that one could resist the weight of the system and still plant, harvest, and thrive. Together, the preacher's words and Carreker's example created a powerful testimony that frightened the men who still believed themselves masters of the land. In small communities like Talbot County, news traveled quickly, and rumors traveled even faster. Soon, white landowners whispered among themselves about the gatherings at Carreker's place, about the blind man who spoke too boldly, about the farmer who seemed too defiant. To them, the combination was intolerable. Violence had always been their answer when law and custom seemed insufficient. And now they looked at Carreker's home not just as a farm but as a threat to the fragile balance of their control. Their fear twisted into resolve, and what had once been mere resentment began to harden into a plan. But for those who heard the preacher, even brief encounters with his voice could not be easily erased. His words lingered long after the gatherings ended, carried into the fields and whispered in the cabins at night. He reminded people that fear was the weapon most often used against them, and that rejecting it was the first step toward reclaiming their humanity. His blindness, far from diminishing his power, made his courage more striking. For here was a man who could not see the faces before him yet still spoke as though he saw into their souls. In the story of William Carreker and the blind preacher, we glimpse the power of words to threaten even the strongest walls of oppression. It was not armies or laws that stirred the anxiety of the white farmers. It was the possibility that ordinary men and women, armed only with dignity and hope, might begin to believe in their own freedom. Carreker's choice to shelter the preacher was simple hospitality, but in the charged atmosphere of the South in 1909, it was also an act of quiet rebellion, one that showed solidarity with voices too easily silenced. The elderly preacher, with his frail body and sightless eyes, became a figure who embodied resistance not through force but through truth. His presence in Carreker's home marked a turning point, a moment when defiance became more than individual. It became communal, woven through sermons, through example, through the courage to imagine something beyond the limits imposed by the county's powerful. And though white farmers saw this as a danger to be extinguished, for those who listened, it was a light flickering against the darkness of fear, a reminder that their struggle was not theirs alone, but part of a larger story that would not be erased. By allowing the preacher to stay, Carreker drew the gaze of those who sought to preserve the old order at any cost, and the tensions that followed would soon place his life in peril. Yet the significance of those days was not only in the danger they invited but in the strength they revealed, in the way words and example together created a force strong enough to unsettle centuries of control. The preacher's message, carried on voices in the fields, lived far beyond his sermons, and Carreker's defiance ensured that it would not die unspoken. In their alliance, fragile and brief though it may have been, the seeds of resistance were sown deeper than fear could ever uproot. The tension that had been simmering in Talbot County for months finally reached its breaking point at William Carreker's home. What began as whispers among white farmers about the blind preacher's sermons and Carreker's bold independence soon turned into something far more dangerous. Fear has a way of reshaping into action when men feel their authority is slipping, and in the minds of the local landowners, William Carreker had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just a farmer working his own land. He had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon for others who might dare to believe that they too could escape the cycle of debt and control. For the men who had always believed themselves to be the unquestioned masters of the land, this was intolerable. Among them was Leonard, a wealthy farmer whose influence stretched across the county. He was not accustomed to challenge, nor was he a man who accepted even the hint of defiance. To Leonard, Carreker's landownership was already an affront, but harboring the preacher and allowing his sermons to inspire others was something far more threatening. In Leonard's eyes, it was as though Carreker was planting seeds not of cotton but of rebellion, seeds that could spread and weaken the system that gave men like Leonard wealth and power. So he resolved to put an end to it, not with law or with dialogue, but with the kind of intimidation that had long been used to keep black families in their place. On that day in 1909, Leonard arrived at Carreker's home, accompanied by the weight of his anger and the certainty that his authority could not be challenged. The preacher was there, his voice already known to those who had gathered in hushed moments, his presence still a source of unease for men like Leonard. What words were exchanged before the violence broke out are lost to history, but the air was thick with hostility. Leonard expected deference, the lowering of eyes, the silent submission that had so often met his confrontations in the past. But Carreker, standing on his own ground, was not willing to bend. He had too much at stake, too much pride in the life he had built, too much belief that he deserved the dignity of independence. The argument escalated, sharp words turning into threats, threats sliding into action. Then came the moment that would shatter the fragile balance that had held. A gun was fired, and when the smoke cleared, Leonard the wealthy farmer, the man who had believed himself untouchable, lay dead. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the realization that something irreversible had just occurred. In that instant, the struggle for survival and dignity that Carreker embodied collided with the brutal order that Leonard represented, and the outcome would not be forgotten by either side. For Carreker, the shooting was not the end but the beginning of a storm. In the eyes of white landowners, Leonard's death was not a tragedy to be weighed with fairness or truth. It was an affront to their authority, an insult that demanded retribution. Whether Carreker had fired in self-defense or not mattered little to those who gathered in anger. What mattered was that a black man had stood his ground against a white landowner. And worse, that the landowner had fallen. Such a story could not be allowed to spread without consequence, for it risked inspiring others to imagine that resistance was possible. Within hours, word of the confrontation spread like wildfire through Talbot County. White farmers and townsmen whispered the news, their voices laced with fury and disbelief. Groups began to form, men gathering under the guise of protecting order, but their true aim was vengeance. For them, Leonard's death was not an isolated incident. It was a threat to the entire racial order, a challenge that demanded a swift and merciless response. They spoke not of law or trial but of justice in their own hands, the kind that had for generations been wielded as a weapon to silence and terrorize. Inside Carreker's home, The atmosphere must have been one of dread. The preacher, blind yet fully aware of the danger now circling them, likely understood the gravity of what had been unleashed. Carreker himself, though standing on his own land, knew that the very soil beneath him could not protect him from the wave of retaliation about to descend. In killing Leonard, whether by intent or defense, he had struck at the heart of the system, and such a blow would never go unanswered. As night fell over the county, the lines were already being drawn. On one side stood Carreker, the preacher, and those who had quietly gathered hope from their defiance. On the other side loomed the collective force of white landowners, enraged and determined to remind the entire community of their power. What had begun as an argument at a farmer's home was about to ripple outward, transforming into a confrontation between freedom and control, between a fragile independence and the machinery of oppression that refused to loosen its grip. Leonard's death marked more than the loss of a wealthy farmer. It marked the unraveling of the illusion that control was absolute. For one brief moment, a black man had resisted and survived, and that was enough to send tremors through the county. Yet those tremors would soon become waves of violence, as the response to Leonard's death would reveal just how deeply the system was willing to go to preserve itself. In the stillness after the gunfire, Carreker must have understood that his life and the lives of those around him were now in peril. The preacher's words had inspired hope, but they had also stirred fear in the hearts of men who thrived on domination. The shot that ended Leonard's life echoed far beyond that yard, reverberating across Talbot County, a sound that would be answered not with silence but with blood. What happened at Carreker's home was not an isolated clash, but the spark that would ignite the fury of those determined to crush defiance wherever it appeared. Thus, the story of William Carreker and Leonard did not end with the fall of one man. It opened a chapter of reckoning, where the fragile pursuit of independence met the unyielding resistance of a system built on control. It was a moment where the line between survival and sacrifice blurred, where dignity demanded a price, and where the fight for freedom revealed itself not as a distant dream, but as a dangerous and immediate struggle played out on the very soil of Georgia. The gunshot that ended Leonard's life did not linger in silence for long. By the next day, Talbot County was alive with the hum of rage, voices uniting in calls for revenge. It was not justice that stirred them, nor truth, but the deep and unyielding need to reassert a crumbling sense of authority. In their eyes, Leonard's death was not the act of one man, but an assault on the very order they had built their lives upon. And so the search for vengeance began, swift and merciless, targeting not only William Carreker but also the blind preacher whose words had dared to stir hope. The preacher, frail and without sight, had never lifted a weapon. His sermons had carried no bullets, only the weight of truth. Yet to the men who now gathered in mobs, his voice had been as dangerous as any gun. They remembered the stories of his preaching at Carreker's home, the whispers that black families left his gatherings with heads held a little higher, shoulders a little straighter. They saw him not as a man but as a symbol, and symbols were often treated with more cruelty than flesh. The mob descended upon him with the cold certainty that silencing his voice would send a message louder than any sermon he had ever delivered. They took him to the edge of a bridge, a place where the air hung heavy over the waters below. He could not see their faces, but he must have felt the heat of their hatred in the way they surrounded him, in the grip of rough hands that dragged him forward. There were no words of mercy, no hesitation. What followed was swift and brutal, an act of violence designed not only to destroy one man but to stain the land with terror. When his body fell, lifeless and broken, the bridge itself became marked by the cruelty of that night. From then on, it carried a new name among the locals: Blind Man's Bridge, a grim reminder of what happens when defiance dares to find a voice. The renaming was not accidental. It was intentional, a way to fix the memory in place, to ensure that every passerby remembered the price of resistance. For the mob, it was a warning etched into the geography of their county. A landmark built not from stone or wood but from fear. They wanted the story to spread. Wanted black families to carry the weight of the name as they crossed the bridge, each step echoing with the unspoken command to remain silent, obedient, and unseen. But their fury did not end with the preacher. For all his words, the true focus of their anger remained William Carreker. Leonard's death was the wound they sought to avenge, and Carreker was the man whose independence had set this storm in motion. The preacher's murder was the opening act, but the mob was determined to finish the story with Carreker's blood. Carreker must have known from the moment Leonard fell that his days were numbered. His land, his pride, his defiance, all of it had painted a target on his back. He was not simply a man defending his home. In the eyes of the mob, he had become the embodiment of rebellion. When they finally seized him, there was no trial, no chance to plead his case, no moment of reckoning before a court of law. The mob acted as judge, jury, and executioner, carrying out their will with the brutal efficiency of men who had long practiced this kind of terror. They dragged him into the open, where his death would not be hidden but witnessed. Lynchings were never carried out in secrecy. They were staged as spectacles, meant to drive home the lesson that no act of resistance would go unanswered. The details of that night remain blurred by time, but the outcome was certain. Carreker's body, once strong from the labor of his own fields, was left lifeless at the hands of men who sought to make an example of him. His death was more than vengeance for Leonard, it was a declaration to the entire community. A violent assertion that the racial order of Talbot County would not bend without blood. The preacher and Carreker, two men bound by circumstance and conviction, met the same fate by different paths. One was silence for the power of his words, the other for the audacity of his independence. Their deaths were not isolated tragedies. They were woven into a pattern of violence that stretched across the South, where mobs used murder to enforce control, where bridges and trees and crossroads bore silent witness to lives cut short in the name of preserving an unjust order. And yet, even in their cruelty, the mob left behind something they had not intended. In naming the bridge after the blind preacher, they preserved the memory of the very man they tried to erase. In killing Carreker, they elevated his defiance into a story that would not remain buried in the soil of his farm. Though fear spread in the wake of their deaths, so too did memory, carried quietly in the hearts of those who had listened to the preacher's sermons, who had watched Carreker tend his fields with pride, who had seen the cost of independence but also its dignity. Blind Man's Bridge became a marker not only of terror but of truth, a reminder that even in the darkest acts of violence, the voices of those silenced continue to echo. Carreker's lynching was meant to end defiance. But instead, it revealed just how fragile the system truly was, how easily it could be shaken by a single man standing on his own land, by a single preacher daring to speak. The story of that summer in 1909 was written in blood and fear, but it was also written in resilience. For every mob that rose to destroy, there were men and women who carried forward the memory of those lost, who passed on their names, their courage, and their defiance. The bridge still stood. The land still bore its scars. But beneath the shadow of violence, seeds of resistance continued to take root, waiting for the day when voices could rise again without fear of being silenced. The killing of William Carreker and the blind preacher was not just the story of two men caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was part of a much larger pattern that reveals how deeply the South clung to a system built on inequality. By 1909, slavery was officially long gone, but its shadow remained, reshaped into laws, economic traps, and, when those failed, raw violence. The deaths of Carreker and the preacher were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were deliberate demonstrations meant to show an entire community that any step toward independence would be punished with terror. What happened in Talbot County reflected a nationwide truth. Across the South, black farmers who tried to buy land, black laborers who resisted unfair contracts, and black leaders who dared to speak up were singled out for intimidation, dispossession, or worse. These were not random bursts of anger. They were systemic efforts planned, coordinated, and accepted by the power structures that looked away when mobs gathered at midnight or when judges turned the law into a weapon. Violence was not just about vengeance. It was a tool to enforce submission, to remind black families that progress carried a price. The bridge renamed after the preacher stands as a chilling reminder of this truth. The mob did not only want to kill him. They wanted his death to echo, to live on in the landscape itself, so that fear would settle into the bones of every black man, woman, and child who crossed it. And Carreker's lynching, carried out in a public square, was the same message delivered in another form. These killings were staged as performances. They were spectacles of control. They were designed to leave scars not just on bodies, but on entire communities. Yet the very fact that we tell their story today means the mob did not fully succeed. They silenced Carreker's voice, but they could not silence his memory. They killed the preacher, but they could not erase the power of his message. Instead, their violence revealed the fragility of the system they sought to preserve. If the independence of one farmer and the words of one preacher could threaten the order of an entire county, then that order was weaker than it appeared. Looking back, the story of William Carreker forces us to reckon with the resilience it took to even attempt independence under such conditions. It reminds us that freedom was never simply given. It was fought for daily, often against overwhelming odds. And it shows us how systemic oppression was not only written into law, but etched into the land through acts of terror designed to last for generations. Understanding this history matters, because the echoes of these struggles are still with us. Conversations about land, opportunity, and justice are still unfinished. And remembering the sacrifices of people like Carreker helps us see the depth of what was endured and what was resisted. So as we close this chapter, let us not only remember the cruelty of what was done, but also the courage it took to stand, even for a moment, against an unjust order. William Carreker's life and the blind preacher's words may have been cut short, but their story remains a testament to the strength of resistance and the high cost of dignity in a world that tried to deny it. Their memory asks us to reflect, to learn, and to ensure that the lessons of 1909 are never forgotten. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story, and for allowing their voices to live on through memory. If you found this history meaningful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that more people can learn about these hidden chapters of our past. Your support helps keep these important stories alive.